Tantor Audio presents The Antidote, Inside the World of New Pharma by Barry Werth. Narrated by Sean Pratt. Introduction. Why I went back inside Vertex. 20 years ago, I wrote a book about a bold and bruising quest. I told the story of a group of entrepreneurial young scientists who left the world's best drug company, the most admired business in America year after year, because they were confident they would be more productive on their own, starting from scratch. They aimed to design better drugs, atom by atom. Most people across the industry thought their project in a refitted construction company garage in Cambridge, Massachusetts, to build an organization that could produce dramatically improved medicines to transform the lives of people with serious diseases, was a pipe dream, a money pit, a consuming act of arrogance, an exhausting feat of hubris, a fool's errand. Don't you think this is 5 years too early? Founding scientist and president Joshua Boger was often asked. Yes, he would say, but 5 years from now it'll be 5 years too late. I found their passionate belief in science and in themselves, brimming with high purpose and combative glee, stirring and infectious, as I followed them around for a couple of years while they tried to get their cash-starved company, Vertex Pharmaceuticals, off the ground. It was a rocky, exhilarating, eye-opening ride. The chase for new leads was fierce, not just against Mother Merck, but also top academic labs, including those led by some of their own scientific advisors, who they feared were sharing Vertex's most prized insights with its rivals. When Boger settled for a tie in a race to publication against one of them, a Harvard professor, he told me, "I'll take it, but I want to rub his nose in the dirt and step on his head." Such was the knife edge between cooperation and competition in the new biopharmaceutical order. Whatever unease I felt at witnessing up close how ferocious capitalism and scientific rivalries, rather than, say, altruism, drove the search for new life-saving drugs, receded in the wake of Vertex's precocious early success. Boger assembled a team of talented, rapidly motivated biologists, chemists, biophysicists, and computer scientists, while he and his chief lieutenant tap-danced their way around the world to raise the money they would need to compete with the pharmaceutical behemoths. Though they were spectacularly outspent and outmaneuvered in every area, he let them organize themselves, rather than try to direct them from above. He let them fail, time and again, until they came up with better approaches. He was a visionary goal-setter, an inspirer. Against all odds, within 4 years, Vertex proved it could compete at the forefront of drug research, against the industry leaders in several major areas at once. It had gone public, and Wall Street considered it a hot stock. What I saw impressed me as a worthy, honest, compelling, even noble effort, both to beat and influence the world around it, a world where life-changing new drugs were getting harder and harder to find, despite the best efforts of hundreds of companies, employing tens of thousands of equally gifted and passionate researchers, and spending hundreds of billions of dollars on research and development. That was the story I told in The Billion-Dollar Molecule. I was encouraged by the company's progress, pleased, too, that the book was acclaimed as an insightful look inside the world of commercial medicine. But I understood that the upstart biotech looks promising version of events that I had reported wasn't the full story, or even the main one. Boger had set out to build a drug company, but Vertex hadn't yet produced a drug. Nowhere near it. For him and the other company pioneers, the large prize wasn't organizing a research group to find better compounds. It was to build a business that could go head-to-head with the world's most profitable drug makers against the hardest diseases, involving some of competitive capitalism's most complicated science and most cutthroat marketing maneuvers. I described the opening skirmish, not the war. The modern pharmaceutical industry emerged from one of the great triumphs of 20th century science. Before the 1940s, there were medicines and companies that made them, but no one had invented a method for actively finding and developing new drugs. Profits in medicine were disdained as suspect, immoral, and the companies were essentially manufacturers of fine chemical compounds. Since their products could do as much harm as good, integrity was key. Then university laboratories advanced a new approach: microbial screening, systematically harvesting large numbers of chemicals from good bugs and feeding them to bad bugs, then monitoring and improving their activity. Drug makers produced and brought to patients the first antibacterials that had been actively sought and developed. The chase was on. For new diseases to treat, testing strategies, business opportunities, scientists, alliances with leading doctors, prestige, and money. As with all things in America, World War II was the great catalyst. Just as the companies were flexing their research and development arms to tackle other diseases, the government enlisted them in the war effort. In 1941, the Germans were rumored to have isolated the chemical secretion of the adrenal cortex, cortisone, and given it to their pilots, amping them up, emboldening them. Battlefield wounds and home-front contagions drove the need for better antibiotics, vaccines, pain relievers, and surgical products. Drug makers were marshaled to counter the threat of a pharmacologic arms race. By mid-century, U.S. companies had more than matched the government's urgency and were racing ahead, developing new biological models to screen against. Profits began to pour in. Wall Street stood up and took notice. The companies grew spectacularly. Merck, where Boger started his career in 1979, after getting a Ph.D. in chemistry at Harvard and doing a postdoctoral stint with future Nobel laureate Jean-Marie Lehn, was their paragon. It best represented the qualities that the industry exalted: a patient-centered, high science focus combined with unrivaled organizational commitment to R&D. It wasn't always the most profitable drug company. Pfizer and others were better at making money, but its research campuses in New Jersey and outside Philadelphia attracted the most promising scientists. It was where you wanted to be, the top of the pyramid. In the 1970s and 1980s, with the swift expansion of government-sponsored research spurred on by the war on cancer, and as the universities and Wall Street simultaneously discovered a bonanza in the life sciences, there was an explosion in medical understanding, and the low-hanging fruit were quickly plucked. Merck's labs launched the first or second significant drugs for cholesterol, hypertension, osteoporosis, and asthma, as well as a class of pain medications known as COX-2 inhibitors. At Merck, as elsewhere, scientists burned to do path-breaking work on new medical frontiers, but increasingly, in management suites and boardrooms across the industry, the consequences of success yielded a conservative strategy consensus. Move cautiously rather than struggle to produce breakthroughs. Settle for modest, quick-to-market improvements where treatments already exist, and where the resulting products can be aggressively marketed to doctors and people with chronic diseases. Gradualism held zero appeal for Boger. Now, I don't think there's anything wrong with bringing an incremental advance to the marketplace. You're not a bad person, he says. It's just, I don't want to do that. Life's too short. Biotechnology companies by now had joined the competition. A few top university professors or government scientists with a tantalizing idea could raise tens of millions of dollars, go out and test it, then go public, when all they had to sell to investors was a theory, and the only certainty in their business model was years and years of progressively more unprofitable darkness. Wall Street blew hot and cold, periodically falling hard for their stories of genetic breakthroughs and miracle cures before returning to its senses. Merck, recognizing Boger's talents, if not buying into his ideas about building better drugs by applying advances from the biotech, software, and computer graphics industries, encouraged him to do his experiment, letting him piece together a team in immunology. But he quickly felt thwarted, impatient, pent up. His frustrations crystallized in the late 1980s, as many things did across the medical world, with the AIDS crisis. Drug makers at first ignored the epidemic, seeing a small market. Off-the-shelf compounds were ineffective and toxic. When Merck entered the arena, many doctors, public health officials, and even some activists felt that the cavalry had arrived. Boger's closest scientific friend in the company, a brilliant and brash young biologist named Irving Siegel, led Merck's project, and Boger cleared the decks in his group to help. CEO Roy Vagelos announced he was damn optimistic about Merck's chances. In late 1988, returning from a meeting in Europe, Siegel was killed when Pan Am Flight 103, carrying 259 people and a terrorist organization's bomb in a cargo container, exploded in a fireball over Lockerbie, Scotland. He was 35. Merck scrambled to recover from its loss. Within a month, Boger was gone. So there I was when Vertex set out in its garage to overtake the bigs. What I saw were staggering contrasts. The major pharmaceutical companies were lumbering along, mightily equipped, cash-rich, charging higher and higher prices while bringing out fewer and fewer important drugs, their reputation for putting profit before patients replayed and reinforced in the AIDS epidemic. It was 15 years into the war on cancer, and cancer was winning in a rout. The biotechs had yet to pay out, and Wall Street was skittish about their high failure rate and the chronic risk and volatility of an industry where horizons were measured in decades. It was into this environment that Boger led his young company. Now, leap ahead to early 2011. The grinding recovery from the worst financial crisis in 80 years, the raging political storm over Obamacare, a drumbeat of lurid press reports about the drug business revealing an industry in crisis and under siege. Vertex, after 22 years and $3.6 billion in losses, was about to launch its first drug under its own name, a major breakthrough against the leading cause of advanced liver disease. It had a second drug nearing regulatory approval that promised to revolutionize the treatment of the most common inherited fatal disease in the United States and Europe. Just as the world around it was shuddering, Vertex was poised to soar. What better vantage point for witnessing the mounting collision of medicine, money, and society? I went back inside Vertex to learn what it takes to succeed in science and business, yes, but also in fleshing out and struggling to achieve a radical vision of a better future. Could a group of very bright, very determined people make a difference in a market dominated by profits and Wall Street? Could true believers in the idea that the purpose of pharmaceutical research is to put patients first and transform the lives of sick people compete in an industry where it was far preferable to develop, say, a marginally better fifth statin compound for high cholesterol and market the hell out of it, as Pfizer had done with the best-selling drug of all time, Lipitor? Or bury a $500 million sweetheart reimbursement in the fiscal cliff deal, as Amgen did, with its army of 77 lobbyists? Or pay a generic company $42 million not to market a cheaper version of your drug so you can keep selling it at 10 times the cost to consumers, as in a recent restraint of trade case before the Supreme Court? Could Vertex still be Vertex in our genomic age, when understanding which drugs to prescribe will depend on an ever-deepening biological profiling of individual patients? What was I seeking? Hope, really. The $325 billion prescription drug business is America's most challenging and one of its most profitable. It's tougher and riskier at nearly every stage than any other business. Yawning biological uncertainties haunt every experiment. The failure rate, even after a candidate clears all the myriad hurdles to reach human testing, is 30 to 1. The cost of ramping up a successful product typically exceeds $1 billion. Drug makers operate in the world's most regulated commercial environment, matched only by nuclear power. Small companies face an extra test. Dependent on Wall Street for financing, they must navigate a myopic trading culture that disdains and crowds out long-term thinking and investment. All progress in the pharmaceutical business is backbreaking, freighted with unknowns, takes twice as long as you think it will, and is liable to blow at any seam, as Tom Wolfe wrote about the endless, ineffable peril of staking it all on a lofty, high-risk mission. Mostly I wanted to see what it had taken to prevail against such harrowing obstacles. What had Boger's vision become, and did it represent a true way ahead in our boundlessly promising and still barely comprehended new biological epoch? After he'd resigned from Merck, alone without first taking anyone with him, and without any assurance that anyone would follow, Boger went home and sketched his goals on a whiteboard. Make better drugs faster. Create the 21st century biopharmaceutical company. Become Merck, only better, he had written. It was almost a haiku. He thought it would take him 20 years and $1 billion. Now, just 2 years later, and nearly 4 times the cost, Vertex verged on proving all that he had set out to do. One of the most common questions I've gotten lately is, "Gee, did you ever imagine this would occur?" he told Vertex's sales troops that spring. It was a few days after Osama bin Laden was killed in Pakistan after a decade-long manhunt, and the company was counting down to launch, primed to go one-on-one against Merck for the richest commercial opportunity in pharma. My completely unsatisfying answer is, yes, absolutely. Now, that comes across to some people as fairly arrogant, and to that I say, arrogance is only a problem if it doesn't turn out to be true. If it turns out to be true, it's just persistence. I discovered at Vertex that biomedical research emits a high emotional heat. It may be tempting to think that the competitive commitment in other disruptive tech industries is similar, but the comparison is slender. In Silicon Valley, you're trying to make a better product, not cure cystic fibrosis or Parkinson's disease. Here, the difference between success and failure can be the difference between life and death. Vertex was about to debut not only the first drugs discovered and developed by its own people and commercialized under its own label. It was about to debut itself, an organization of nearly 2,000 people, sculpted as much by the changing healthcare economy and the gyrations of its industry over the past 2 decades as by Boger and the others who joined him. They had had notable early success in the crucible of that new biomedical order, AIDS, but that victory had been Pyrrhic, because, while it had produced a drug, Vertex hadn't fully emerged along with it. Now the company would correct that disparity. Boger was right about arrogance. We may not like it in our faces, but it's a problem only when it doesn't turn out to be true. Part 1. Feeding the Beast. Chapter 1. April 28th, 1993. Boston's World Trade Center, unlike New York's, is not a beacon of wealth and power, but a refitted waterfront mercantile mart. It squatted on a pier above the city's famously ruined harbor, offering a postcard view of downtown. Boger, age 42, stepped onto the podium before 250 worried executives at the annual meeting of the Massachusetts Biotechnology Council, a statewide trade group. In 4 years, his highly unlikely startup had grown to 110 people, sprawling among a warren of reconverted lab buildings near MIT, a public company with $50 million in the bank, and its reputation as a leader in structure-based drug design was supported chiefly by a string of impressive publications. The company had competitive research projects in multiple disease areas. Even those who'd thought its long-term goals delusional had to concede its short-term progress. Across the industry, the mood was black. In February, a month after Bill Clinton took office, he announced that his wife, Hillary, would oversee national health care reform, and at an appearance together at a Virginia medical clinic, the president denounced shockingly high drug prices. He cited figures showing the industry spent more on marketing than on research, demanded that drug makers change their ways, and suggested that he would propose price controls if they didn't. As one analyst put it, Clinton had decided to go to war with the pharmaceutical companies, rich targets in the struggle against spiraling health costs. A few days later, a congressional study criticized drug makers' excess profits. In the 2 months since, all drug stocks, big and small, had lost 1/3 of their value. "I expect to see frogs raining down from the sky sometime soon," Boger said. He was 6'5", rangy, all angles, with a broad forehead capped by thinning, stick-straight brown hair. Tinted aviator glasses did nothing to dim an enveloping gaze, and generally ecstatic grin. His cadences echoed a small-town North Carolina boyhood, where, from a young age, he found himself explaining things to his unaccountably obtuse elders. Invited to discuss the industry perspective, Boger forecast a reckoning. Only the smartest, fleetest, most adaptable companies such as Vertex that were burning tens, hundreds of millions of dollars, chasing a broad portfolio of breakthrough drugs for serious diseases, would compete successfully in the new period, he said. Why? Because we're more motivated, and the fear of death and God is closer to us. Chortling, Boger concluded with a bit of light heresy, a slide of a New Yorker cartoon showing an executive telling a lab-coated scientist sketching at a whiteboard, "I like it. Find a disease for it." Strictly speaking, Vertex wasn't a biotechnology company. It wasn't trying to engineer new products by manipulating genes, so-called biologics. It aspired to make small molecule drugs, little pills and bottles with cotton on top, as Boger put it, the time-honored staple of traditional pharmaceutical discovery and development. But with the prospect of launching its own products still many years off, and by no means certain, and with it burning prodigiously through capital, Vertex was a biotech by default. Boger often joked that he didn't know it was a biotech company until Kidder Peabody, the investment bank that took it public, told him it was. Despite the dire mood, he had earned his cheerful attitude, mostly through back-breaking pursuit, although luck and charisma helped. He had proved he could sell Vertex's story no matter how distressed the market was. 2 weeks earlier, Vertex had announced a $20 million deal with Kissei Pharmaceutical Company, the fastest-growing Japanese drug company, to develop AIDS medicines in the Far East. Entrepreneurs forever hustle for capital, but Kissei, an improbable suitor, had initiated the contact months earlier, coming to Boger as if off a cloud. He and Richard Aldrich, Vertex's chief business officer, had been shopping other projects on one of their twice-yearly death marches through dozens of executive suites in East Asia in late January. The Japanese had yet even to acknowledge that AIDS existed in their country, so severe was the stigma. Yet Vertex's business liaison urged them to visit Kissei in Matsumoto City on a misty high mountain plateau 6 hours from Tokyo. Long ride, switching trains, Aldrich recalls. We didn't know them. We were resistant, but he said, "No, they really want to meet you. This could be worthwhile." I remember we were in the car driving between labs. One of the Kissei guys turned around. Josh and I were in the back seat, and he says to Josh, "Dr. Boger, at Kissei you are a god." And of course Josh immediately liked Kissei. Within 45 minutes of arriving there, we went into a side room with the senior guys and started talking money on the deal. Such good fortune and adulation might have gone to Boger's head if not for the unending pressure, in the face of minimal resources, to get as many projects off the ground and find partners for them as soon as possible. An endeavor that, like drug discovery, resulted in failure more than 90% of the time. Right now, AIDS and the virus that caused it, HIV, gave the company its best hope for getting a drug to doctors and patients. Following Boger's speech to the executives, senior scientist Mark Merco delivered a spirited recap of Vertex's design strategies for a new class of direct-acting antiviral drugs, HIV protease inhibitors, that the company was relying on to catapult it into the ranks of the world's elite drug makers. Merco, 33, was the last of a half-dozen major Merck defectors to join Vertex, and the one Boger had fought hardest to get, platooning the scientists to call him every other night for 3 months until he agreed to move. More and more he'd become Boger's technology seeker, sidekick, everyman, and commentator. A stocky, precocious, deep-voiced, aside-tossing Sancho Panza. At first, Boger refused to get into AIDS, but Merco and a few others changed his mind. Merco peppered his slide presentation of elegant computer-generated three-dimensional molecular models with striking new data and throwaway jibes at traditional discovery methods. He told the audience about a drug hunt of rare effectiveness and speed. Proteases are enzymes that cleave other sections of protein, in the case of HIV, enabling it to multiply. Theoretically, if a small molecule could latch onto the active site, it would block replication. HIV protease offered a promising new drug, and Merck and several other companies had compounds in the clinic, although none had yet shown that their molecules were effective in patients. More to the point, the target site was only Vertex's second project. The first had crashed spectacularly when the mechanism for which it was churning out compounds proved to be biologically irrelevant. Merck was spending more on HIV than any other research effort in its history, throwing hundreds of chemists at the project. Vertex, Merco said, had just 5. Vertex needed to speed up the process of getting its own compounds to patients, something it had never done before, and that would not be possible at this stage without another partner. What the company had was Boger, hubris, and a passionate group of mostly ex-Merck researchers as determined as he was to do it right. Merck's first team making drugs for the hardest diseases with computers, as Aldrich liked to tell potential partners and investors. Structure-based drug design is premised on having a reliable 3D computer model of the target molecule in the body, so as to be able to visualize the inmost workings of living matter. Vertex had industrialized its processes for isolating and purifying proteins to the point where it could reliably solve complex structures showing how different prospective drug molecules bound to the business end of a target. Merco's group digitally modeled new atomic interactions and suggested improvements based on predicted changes in activity. This feedback loop, he told the audience, enabled Vertex's small group of chemists to make much more informed choices than Merck's legions about what molecules to make next. Not everyone was sold. After lunch, the keynote speaker, Dr. Edward Skolnick, president of Merck Laboratories, unfurled himself from a too-small chair on the dais and rose to deliver a talk entitled Molecular Approaches to Drug Design. Merco, sitting just to his right, smiled, amused. Skolnick was notably hard-charging. He had driven the billion-dollar drug Mevacor, the first of the cholesterol-reducing statins, to market, devoting a significant portion of his toxicology budget to overcoming concerns about statin toxicity. Merck's findings convinced the U.S. Food and Drug Administration that what seemed to be cancerous changes in animals weren't really cancers, and that a resumption of human testing of statins after a 3-year moratorium was warranted. Now he was driving Merck's AIDS effort. Though the structure of HIV protease had initially been solved at Merck by yet another of those who would soon grow frustrated and follow Boger to Vertex, Skolnick considered the information it generated just moderately useful for drug discovery. I gave you that title, Skolnick said, but that's not what I'm going to talk about.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?